In the town that judged with laughter, one woman's act of compassion was seen as the ultimate foolishness, an act that would seal her ruin. This story is a testament to the fact that what the world calls foolishness, the heart sometimes knows to be unshakable courage. If you believe in our mission to unearth these forgotten histories of quiet defiance, consider supporting us with a super thanks. And if you already stand with Sarah, leave a "Stay strong, Sarah" in the comments below. The laughter was the first and last thing you noticed. It wasn't a sound of joy or mirth, but a sharp, cruel instrument, honed to a fine edge by years of small-town certainty. It was the sound of judgment, of a community drawing a tight, merciless circle around its own, and casting out anyone who dared to step beyond its invisible lines. It started in the back of the Harmony Creek General Store, a low, rumbling chuckle from the men gathered around the pot-bellied stove, sharing gossip as they whittled. Then it was picked up and polished to a high, cutting sheen by the women standing near the fabric bolts, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. In the spring of 1953, in the small, self-satisfied heart of rural Ohio, that laughter was for Sarah Jenkins. They laughed because, in their eyes, she was a fool, a lonely 30-year-old widow who, after 3 years of admirable but pitiful struggle, had finally broken under the strain. Sarah had been a subject of the town's solemn, suffocating pity ever since her husband Tom was found crushed under his own overturned tractor. The accident left her with a 5-year-old son, Leo, a 30-acre farm groaning under the weight of a mortgage and a future as bleak and unforgiving as a winter sky. Pity, Sarah had learned, was a heavy blanket. It was condescending and it chafed, but it was not a weapon. The laughter, however, was a knife, and it was being twisted with relish. She heard it every time she came into town for supplies, her worn cotton dress clean but faded to the color of a washed-out sky, her son Leo's small hand held tight in her own. She saw it in the eyes of Doris May Pringle, the store owner's wife, a woman whose face was perpetually pinched in disapproval. Doris May would pause in her meticulous counting of canned peaches to watch Sarah with a look of smug commiseration, an expression that said, "See, I knew it would come to this." She felt it in the way Mr. Abernathy, the bank president who held her mortgage and the town's unofficial patriarch, would tip his hat to her. His courtesy was exaggerated, a performance for the town that was its own kind of mockery, a public reminder of her debt and her precarious position. Sarah Jenkins was Harmony Creek's cautionary tale, a living sermon on what happened when a woman was left to fend for herself. She was expected to fail, to fold, to eventually sell her land to Abernathy for a pittance. He was known to be circling it like a vulture and take a job scrubbing floors at the church or the diner. But Sarah had not failed. She was made of tougher, more resilient material than Harmony Creek gave her credit for. She woke before the sun, her hands raw from lye soap and calloused from mending fences, tending to her flock of chickens and her small but productive vegetable garden. She took in mending and sewing from the very women who pitied her, her fingers flying by the dim light of a kerosene lamp late into the night, turning collars and patching seams to earn the few extra dollars that kept the bank's shadow from falling completely across her door. Her life was a constant, grinding battle against entropy, against the weeds in the cornfield and the ever-growing numbers in Mr. Abernathy's ledger. Her love for her son, Leo, was the silent, steady fuel that kept her going, a fierce, protective fire in the hearth of her exhausted heart. The man who would change everything, the man who would turn their pity into ridicule, arrived on a Tuesday in late September. His name was Isaac Washington. He was a passenger on the Greyhound bus that broke down with a final wheezing gasp just outside the town limits, a plume of greasy black smoke signaling its demise. The handful of passengers were ferried into town to wait in the bus depot, a sad, dusty room with peeling paint and hard benches attached to the side of the general store. He stood out immediately. In the sea of weary, rumpled white faces, his was the only black one. He was tall and painfully thin, the worn but impeccably clean uniform of a United States Army soldier hanging loosely on his frame. He carried himself with a profound stillness, a quiet, contained dignity that seemed to wall him off from the curious and often hostile stares of the townspeople, and he was sick. A dry, rattling cough periodically shook his thin frame, a deep, persistent tremor that seemed to come from the very marrow of his bones. He would sit on the hard depot bench for hours, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow and labored, as if the very act of drawing air was a painful, exhausting chore. The townspeople gave him a wide berth, whispering amongst themselves. Doris May Pringle declared loudly enough for everyone to hear that he probably had consumption and that it was a civic disgrace he was allowed to travel and infect decent, God-fearing folk. The replacement bus was delayed. A day passed, then two. Isaac Washington said little, ate nothing that was offered from the store, and seemed to shrink with every passing hour. On the third morning, as Sarah was leaving the general store with a small bag of flour and a single can of peaches, she saw him stumble as he tried to stand up from the bench. He swayed for a moment, his face a mask of grey exhaustion, and then, with a soft sigh, he collapsed onto the dusty floor in a heap of khaki wool. A collective gasp went through the store. People stared, frozen in place, but no one moved. He was a problem, a contamination. He was, most importantly, not their responsibility. Someone summoned Dr. Miller, a fussy, self-important man who arrived and examined Isaac with a clear, undisguised reluctance, his hands barely touching the soldier's body. Exhaustion, the doctor declared to the room at large, as if delivering a weather report. Malnutrition, and his lungs are in a terrible state. He needs rest and proper food. In a colored hospital somewhere, I should think. He then packed his bag, wiped his hands with a handkerchief, and left, having done the bare minimum his oath and the town's expectations required. Isaac was propped back up on the bench by the bus driver, semi-conscious, his breathing a ragged, terrifying whisper, and then the town looked away. They had lives to lead, business to attend to, gossip to spread. He would be the bus company's problem when they finally sent another coach. But Sarah couldn't look away. In the still, broken form on that bench, she saw not a problem, but a person. She saw not a threat, but a man who had worn the uniform of her country and was now being left to die on a dirty floor because of the color of his skin and the sound of his cough. She saw in his exhausted, lonely figure a stark reflection of her own struggle, a mirror of a world that was hard and unforgiving to those who didn't fit neatly into its designated places. With the entire store watching, she walked over to him. The murmuring ceased, replaced by a thick, charged silence. She knelt down on the dusty floorboards. "Soldier," she said softly, her voice clear in the quiet room. "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open. They were deep, dark, and filled with a pain that went far beyond his physical ailment. It was the pain of a man who had expected no better from the world. "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she said, her voice steady. "I have a farm just outside of town. There's a spare room. It's clean and warm. You can rest there." The offer hung in the air like a heresy. It was a profound breach of the town's unwritten but brutally enforced rules. Doris May Pringle's mouth fell open in a perfect O of pure, unadulterated outrage. Mr. Abernathy, who had been observing from the doorway of his bank across the street, scowled with open and immediate disapproval. Isaac looked at her, and a flicker of something, gratitude maybe, but mostly sheer disbelief, passed across his face. "Ma'am," he rasped, the single word a monumental effort. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," she said simply, "but my pa always said you don't leave a man down. It doesn't matter who he is. Now can you walk if I help you?" The memory of what happened next would become the cornerstone of a new and damning town legend. Sarah Jenkins, the poor, struggling widow, the object of their pity, half carrying the sick black soldier out of the general store. She loaded him into the passenger seat of her old Ford flatbed truck, a vehicle held together by rust and stubborn prayer, and drove away away from the silent, staring faces, leaving a wake of stunned, scandalized silence. She took him home. She put him in the small, clean room that had once been her father's, and for a week she nursed him. She fed him thin broth and soft bread. She made sure he took the bottles of medicine the army had given him, and she sat with him in the evenings as the sun set, the two of them saying little, but finding a strange and unexpected comfort in their shared silence. He told her his story in fragments. He had served in Korea in the Army Corps of Engineers, building bridges under fire. He'd suffered from severe frostbite and pneumonia during the brutal winter of '51 at the Chosin Reservoir. His lungs had never recovered. He was on his way to a VA hospital in Cleveland, but he knew, he admitted, that he wouldn't have made it there. "You saved my life, Mrs. Jenkins," he said one evening, his voice stronger and clearer than it had been since his arrival. "You can call me Sarah," she replied. In that small, quiet farmhouse, an unlikely and powerful bond formed. It was not a romance, not then. It was a kinship of outsiders. He saw her strength, her quiet, unyielding stubbornness. She saw his intelligence, the sharp, analytical mind that was visible in his eyes even when his body was weak. He was a good man, a decent and honorable man, and the town's revulsion toward him was a profound injustice that settled in her soul like a stone. When he was finally strong enough to travel again, he prepared to leave. He had no money to pay her, only his boundless gratitude. But Sarah, to her own surprise, found the thought of the house returning to its empty, crushing silence unbearable. Leo had grown attached to the quiet man who showed him how to tie a perfect bowline knot and explained how a pulley could make a small boy strong enough to lift a heavy bucket. And she had grown attached to his presence, to having another adult to share the crushing, unspoken burden of existence. So she made another, even more scandalous decision. "Don't go," she said to him one morning, as he stood by the door, his bag packed. The words were so bold they surprised her own ears. "There's work a man can do here that doesn't require strong lungs. The barn roof leaks. The tractor engine needs a clever mind. And Leo, he needs a man around. I need a man around." She looked him directly in the eye, her offer clear and stripped of all pretense. "This could be a partnership, Isaac, not charity. We could help each other." And that was how, a month later, Sarah Jenkins and Isaac Washington stood before a justice of the peace in the next county over, where no one knew their names or their stories. It was a marriage of convenience, a practical arrangement born of desperation, loneliness, and a shared fundamental humanity. When the news reached Harmony Creek, the town's pity for Sarah curdled instantly into open, gleeful scorn. The laughter that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over, becoming the town's official response. Sarah Jenkins, the poor widow, hadn't just made a fool of herself. She had married a sick, black soldier. She had taken on a permanent burden, not a husband. In their eyes, she had disgraced the memory of her late husband and gleefully sealed her own ruin. The laughter followed her everywhere, a constant cruel soundtrack to her new life, a reminder of her unforgivable transgression against Harmony Creek's rigid, unforgiving code. Their marriage was not a union of passion, but a quiet treaty signed against a hostile world. The first weeks were a study in awkward grace. They moved around each other in the small farmhouse with the careful deference of strangers, each acutely aware of the chasm of race and experience that separated them and the fragile, practical bridge they had built to span it. Isaac slept in the spare room, Sarah in her own bed, and the door between them remained closed. The house was no longer silent, however. It was filled with the sound of Isaac's low, persistent cough, the quiet scratch of his pencil as he sketched diagrams in a small notebook, and the murmur of his voice as he patiently explained things to Leo. Harmony Creek, having passed its initial judgment, now set about the task of enforcing it. The town's laughter had been the declaration of war. Now came the siege. When Sarah went to the general store, Doris May Pringle, who had once offered credit with a condescending smile, now demanded cash on the spot for every purchase. She would weigh the flour and sugar with a heavy thumb, her lips pursed in a permanent sneer. "Times are hard, Sarah," she'd say, her voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "A body has to be careful who they associate with. Bad decisions can be contagious." The social shunning was more painful. Women who had once stopped to chat with Sarah on the street now crossed to the other side, clutching their children's hands as if Sarah herself were a sickness. Leo came home from school one afternoon with his lips split and his eyes clouded with a hurt that went deeper than the bruise. The older boys had cornered him by the creek, taunting him, using words he didn't understand, but whose malice was unmistakable. They called his new father a name that made him feel dirty, and they said his mother was no better. Sarah held him as he cried, her heart a cold, hard knot of fury. She had anticipated her own ostracization, but she had not fully prepared for the cruelty that would be visited upon her son. Mr. Abernathy, the bank president, was the most dangerous of all. He represented the cold, structural power that underpinned the town's social venom. He no longer tipped his hat when he saw her. He would simply stare, his gaze flat and possessive, as if he were already measuring her fields for subdivision. He sent a letter, a crisp, formal note informing her that, due to her significantly altered personal circumstances, the bank would require a full review of her mortgage agreement at the end of the quarter. The implication was clear. Her marriage was a violation of some unspoken morality clause, and he would use it as a pretext to foreclose. Through it all, Isaac remained a figure of quiet, unnerving calm. He saw the insults, he felt the hostility, and he heard Leo's tearful account of the schoolyard bullies, but his face remained an unreadable mask. He had been a black man in America and a soldier in a foreign war. He was no stranger to hatred. He simply absorbed it, his silence a form of defiance more profound than any angry outburst. He could not work the fields. His lungs would not permit it. A few hours of mending fences or clearing brush would leave him breathless and exhausted for the rest of the day. The men at the general store saw this as proof of his uselessness, another sign of Sarah's folly. "Married herself a broken-down charity case," they'd chuckle. "She'll be working to feed two men's mouths now, one in the ground and one in her spare bedroom." But they did not see what Sarah saw. They did not see the way Isaac's mind worked. Tom's tractor, the very machine that had killed him, had sat rusting in the barn for 3 years, a monument to Sarah's grief and a symbol of the work she could not do. Mechanics from the next town over had quoted her prices for repair that were impossibly high. Sarah had resigned herself to letting it decay. Isaac began spending his days in the barn. He didn't attack the engine with a wrench and brute force. He simply sat with it for hours at a time, with the quiet patience of a chess master. He took the engine apart, piece by greasy piece, laying each one out on a clean canvas sheet. He cleaned every part with kerosene, his long, delicate fingers surprisingly nimble. He consulted old, dog-eared army technical manuals he carried in his duffel bag. He made sketches in his notebook, complex drawings of gears and pistons that looked like a secret language to Sarah. Leo would watch him, fascinated. Isaac, in turn, would explain everything in his low, calm voice. "This is a carburetor, Leo. It mixes air and fuel, like a chef mixing ingredients for a cake. If the mix is wrong, the engine gets sick, just like we do." He was teaching the boy not just mechanics, but a way of seeing the world as a series of complex but understandable systems, a world that could be diagnosed and fixed. One crisp October afternoon, after 2 weeks of methodical work, Isaac called Sarah and Leo out to the barn. He had reassembled the engine. With a quiet confidence, he climbed into the driver's seat. He adjusted a few levers, pulled a choke, and pressed the starter. The engine coughed once, a puff of black smoke, then sputtered. It coughed again, and then, with a roar that shook the rafters of the old barn, it caught. It roared to life, a loud, steady, powerful rhythm that was the sound of hope itself. Leo whooped with joy. Sarah stood frozen, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. It was more than just a running engine. It was a resurrection. Isaac had taken the instrument of her husband's death, the symbol of her failure, and had given it back to her as a tool for survival. He had not replaced Tom, but he had done something Tom, a man of brute strength, had never been able to do. He had understood the machine. Isaac's contributions were quiet but transformative. He saw that the well pump, which required Sarah to exhaust herself with 50 strenuous pumps to fill a bucket, was inefficient. He spent a day rigging a simple counterweight system using a pulley and a bucket of rocks, a design he'd used to lift artillery shells in Korea. Suddenly, Leo could pump a full bucket of water with one hand. He saw that the draft in the fireplace was poor, causing the house to fill with smoke and waste precious firewood. He climbed onto the roof, a dangerous, wheezing journey that left him dizzy, and used his engineering knowledge to adjust the flue and build a small wind cap from a discarded coffee can. That winter, for the first time in years, the house was warm and smoke-free. He was not fixing things with strength, but with intelligence. He was a force of quiet, relentless logic in a world that had always been governed for Sarah by the brute forces of nature and the bank. In healing the broken things on her farm, he was also healing the broken spirit of her family. Leo began to carry himself with a new confidence, armed with his stepfather's lessons about levers and fulcrums, and Sarah, watching him, felt a new and unfamiliar emotion blooming in her chest, something warmer and more profound than the gratitude she had felt for his help. It was a deep, bone-weary respect that was slowly, quietly turning into love. But their small, private victories did nothing to appease the town. If anything, they hardened their resolve. Sarah's ability to survive, to even thrive in a small way, was an affront to their judgment. They had predicted her ruin, and she was stubbornly refusing to comply. The letter from Mr. Abernathy arrived on a cold morning in late November. It was not a suggestion this time, but a formal notice, citing a clause in the original agreement about maintaining the farm's standing and good character in the community. The bank was exercising its right to call in the full remaining balance of the loan. They had 90 days to produce $2,000 or the farm would be put up for auction. $2,000. He might as well have asked for the moon. It was a death sentence, elegantly written on bank letterhead. The law, which was supposed to be blind, was being used as a blunt instrument of prejudice. Abernathy had found his legal excuse to crush them. Sarah held the letter, the paper trembling in her hand. The warmth of the freshly lit fire, the sound of the purring tractor engine outside, the sight of Leo reading at the kitchen table, all the small pockets of hope they had built seemed to vanish. The town's laughter had finally found its teeth, and they were closing in for the kill. The foreclosure notice was not just a letter, it was a wall, a sudden impassable barrier at the end of the narrow path they had been trying to clear. Sarah read it 3 times, the cold, legalistic language a stark contrast to the raw, visceral panic that was flooding her system. $2,000 in 90 days. It was an impossible sum, a king's ransom. She made, on a good month, perhaps $30 from her mending and the sale of eggs and vegetables. The bank's demand was not a negotiation, it was an execution. Isaac read the letter over her shoulder, his face grim. His persistent cough, usually a soft counterpoint to the quiet of the farmhouse, was the only sound for a long moment. He placed a gentle hand on her arm. "He can't do this," he said, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. "This isn't legal. The good character clause is meant for running a gambling den, not for who a person marries." It's Harmony Creek," Sarah said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. She was past tears, past rage, in a cold, numb place of utter despair. "Abernathy is the law here. He'll find a judge who agrees with him. He's wanted this land since Tom died. This us." She gestured between the two of them. It just gave him the excuse he was waiting for. The letter marked the beginning of the coldest winter Sarah could remember. The chill outside was mirrored by the creeping cold inside the house, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was the chill of hopelessness. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window panes sounded like a countdown. 90 days. The words were a constant ticking clock in the back of her mind. The news of the foreclosure notice spread through Harmony Creek like a contagion, and the town reacted with a grim, self-satisfied sense of vindication. Their laughter had been prophetic. Sarah Jenkins had made her bed with a sick outsider, and now she was being evicted from it. It was the natural order of things reasserting itself. When she went into town, the looks she received were no longer just scornful. They were triumphant. She was the sinner, and her damnation was a public spectacle for the righteous to enjoy. Sarah tried to fight. She took the bus to the county seat and sat for an hour in the waiting room of a legal aid lawyer, a young, overwhelmed man who glanced at the letter and sighed. "Mr. Abernathy is a very powerful man in this county, Mrs. Washington," he said, already using her new, unfamiliar name. "The clause is vague, and a conservative judge could certainly interpret it in the bank's favor. Your unconventional marriage would make you unsympathetic witnesses." He advised her to try to negotiate, to sell off a piece of the land to satisfy Abernathy. But they both knew Abernathy didn't want a piece. He wanted it all. The weight of it all began to crush her. The daily chores, once a source of comfort and routine, now felt like pointless gestures. Why mend the fence when the land would soon belong to someone else? Why tend the winter garden when she wouldn't be there to harvest it? For the first time, she felt the pull of surrender, the seductive whisper that told her to just give up, to let the town have its victory. It was Isaac who refused to let her fall. His body might have been frail, but his mind, his spirit, was forged from something unyielding. He had survived the frozen hell of a Korean winter, had watched friends die around him, had endured the daily humiliations of a racist world. He would not be broken by a small-town banker and his paper threats. "We don't give up, Sarah," he said one night, as she sat staring into the fire, the foreclosure notice lying on the mantelpiece like a funeral wreath. "We think, we analyze the problem, we find a weakness." "There is no weakness," she whispered. "He has all the power. We have nothing." "That's not true," Isaac countered, his voice firm. "We have this land, we have this house, we have our minds. Abernathy thinks we're a stupid widow and a broken soldier. He's underestimating his opponent. That's a mistake, a fatal one sometimes." His words were a spark in the darkness of her despair. He wasn't just offering empty comfort, he was offering a strategy. He saw their predicament not as a tragedy, but as an engineering problem. He began to apply the same methodical, analytical logic he had used on the tractor engine to their financial crisis. $2,000, he would say, pacing the small kitchen. "What is that? It's a number, a target. We can't make that money the way we have been. So we need a new approach, a new source of revenue." He began to walk the 30 acres of land, not as a farmer would, but as an engineer. He wasn't looking at the quality of the soil for crops. He was studying the topography, the flow of water, the composition of the rock outcroppings. He spent hours by the creek that ran along the southern edge of their property, a shallow, fast-moving stream that Tom had always considered useless for irrigation and a nuisance that flooded in the spring. Isaac, however, saw something different. He saw energy. He saw a gradient, a fall of several feet over a 100-yard stretch. He saw the narrow gorge the creek had cut through the land. He spent days taking measurements, making calculations in his notebook, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. One evening, he unrolled a large, detailed drawing on the kitchen table. It was a complex schematic of gears, a water wheel, and a small turbine. "What is it?" Sarah asked, peering at the intricate drawing. "It's a generator," Isaac said, a quiet fire in his eyes. "A micro-hydroelectric generator. The Army Corps of Engineers experimented with them in the field. Small portable units to power remote command posts. The principle is simple. The creek's water turns a wheel. The wheel turns a turbine. The turbine generates electricity." Sarah stared at him, bewildered. "Electricity? Isaac, we can't even afford to pay the mortgage. We can't build a power plant." "We wouldn't be building a power plant," he explained patiently, his finger tracing the lines on his drawing. "We'd be building a small one just for us, but the potential Harmony Creek's power is unreliable. It comes from a single line from the county station. It goes out in every storm. If we could generate our own consistent power," he trailed off, his mind clearly racing ahead, "and if we could generate more than we need, we could sell it." The idea was so audacious, so far beyond the scope of anything Sarah had ever imagined, that she almost laughed. Sell electricity. They were about to be homeless, and he was talking about becoming a utility company. It was madness. "Where would we get the parts?" she asked, her practical mind immediately identifying the first of 100 obstacles. "The turbine? The generator itself? We build what we can. We salvage the rest," Isaac said, his determination unwavering. "There's a salvage yard over in Madison County, full of old farm equipment, wrecked cars. A generator is just a motor in reverse. We can find a motor. The turbine blades can be hammered out of sheet metal from the old silo roof. The water wheel, we have the timber right here." It was a crazy, desperate, impossible plan, and it was the first glimmer of hope Sarah had felt in months. It was a plan that relied not on money, which they didn't have, but on ingenuity, intelligence, and hard work, which they possessed in abundance. It was a long shot, a 1 in a million chance, but it was better than the slow, agonizing certainty of foreclosure. So they began. Their lives became a race against the ticking clock of the bank's deadline. Isaac's design was their blueprint for survival. They worked from dawn until long after dusk, a small, determined team of 3. Isaac, with his engineer's mind, was the architect. Sarah, with her surprising strength and deep knowledge of the farm, was the builder. And Leo, small but eager, was their apprentice, hauling tools, holding boards, and absorbing every lesson. They started with the water wheel. Using the tractor to haul logs from the small woodlot on their property, they began the arduous task of cutting and shaping the timber. Isaac's cough worsened in the cold, damp air by the creek, but he refused to stop, directing Sarah with precise instructions. He showed her how to notch the logs, how to join them with a strength that would withstand the force of the current. Meanwhile, Isaac made several trips to the salvage yard, bartering with the owner, trading some of Tom's old, rusted tools for a treasure trove of junk. A discarded alternator from a 1940s Chevrolet, a tangle of heavy-gauge copper wire, a set of massive ball bearings from a wrecked piece of industrial machinery. He would return to the farm, his eyes gleaming, and spread his finds out on the barn floor like a pirate's treasure. Each piece of rust and scrap was a component in his grand design. The work was brutal, back-breaking, and relentless. Sarah's hands, already calloused, became cracked and raw. Her muscles ached with a deep, permanent fatigue. But as the structure by the creek began to take shape, the solid wooden frame, the massive axle for the water wheel, so too did her hope. They were not just building a machine, they were building a future. They were fighting back, not with lawyers and pleas for mercy, but with wood and steel and the sheer force of their will. The town could laugh, but the sound of their hammer and saw was a sound of defiance, an answer to the town's scorn, echoing through the cold winter air. The 90-day deadline loomed over them like a perpetually grey sky, but on the farm, a frantic, focused energy had taken hold. The project by the creek became the sun around which their lives orbited. Every waking moment was dedicated to the construction of Isaac's improbable machine. The winter deepened, dusting the fields with snow and turning the mud by the creek into a treacherous frozen slurry. The cold was a constant gnawing enemy, seeping through their worn coats and stiffening their fingers, but they worked on. Isaac was the mind, Sarah the muscle. While he was physically limited, his intellect was boundless. He would spend hours huddled over his diagrams, his breath misting in the frigid air of the barn, modifying his designs to accommodate the scavenged parts he had acquired. He was a master of improvisation, a genius of making do. The alternator from the Chevy wasn't powerful enough on its own, so he devised a complex system of gears, salvaged from a a broken threshing machine to increase the rotations and multiply the electrical output. The ball bearings were too large for the axle he had designed, so he spent 2 days painstakingly building a new housing for them, using a hand drill and a metal file with a patience that was almost supernatural. Sarah, fueled by a desperate, ferocious energy, performed feats of strength she never would have thought possible. She single-handedly dug the trench for the sluice that would channel the creek's water to the wheel, her shovel striking the frozen earth with rhythmic, determined thuds. She learned to use a block and tackle, a system Isaac taught her, to hoist the heavy, waterlogged timbers into place. Her body was a symphony of aches and pains, her muscles screaming in protest each morning, but she ignored it. Every timber she lifted, every nail she drove, was a blow against Mr. Abernathy, against the town, against the fate they had prescribed for her. Leo, caught up in the urgency of the project, became an indispensable part of the team. He was small, but he was quick and fearless. He would shimmy into tight spaces that Isaac and Sarah couldn't reach, tightening bolts and feeding wires. He became the keeper of the tools, his young mind a perfect catalogue of which wrench was needed, where the box of screws was. He watched Isaac with a quiet, reverent awe, absorbing not just the practical skills, but the philosophy behind them, that no problem was unsolvable if you looked at it with a clear mind and a steady hand. The town of Harmony Creek watched their frantic activity with a mixture of amusement and contempt. Farmers driving past on the main road would slow their trucks, point toward the strange wooden structure rising by the creek, and laugh. The consensus at the general store was that the poor widow had finally gone completely mad, and her crazy husband was indulging her fantasies. Building a newfangled outhouse, are they? One of the men at the stove cackled. Maybe they think Abernathy will let them stay if they build him a fancy toilet. Their project was seen as the final pathetic act of a family that had lost its grip on reality. As the weeks passed, the machine began to take shape, a testament to their relentless labor. The great water wheel, 10 feet in diameter, was assembled flat on the ground, a masterpiece of rough-hewn carpentry. Inside the small shed they had built to house the mechanics, the alternator and the complex array of gears were mounted on a heavy timber frame. The final piece was the turbine, which Isaac fashioned himself. He spent a week in the barn, hammering and shaping blades from the rusted sheet metal of the old silo, his cough echoing in the cold space. The finished product was not pretty, but it was functional, each blade angled with a precision born of Isaac's engineering knowledge. With only 3 weeks left before the bank's deadline, it was time for the most difficult part of the operation, raising the great water wheel and setting it onto its axle. It was a massive, impossibly heavy object. There was no crane, no engine powerful enough to lift it. There was only the 3 of them, and Isaac's understanding of physics. He spent 2 days setting up an intricate system of levers and pulleys, using the strongest trees by the creek as anchor points. It was a high-stakes gamble. If a rope snapped, if a lever broke, the wheel would be destroyed, and their entire effort would have been for nothing. The day they chose for the lift was cold and clear. Sarah and Isaac worked in a tense, focused silence, communicating with hand signals and single-word commands. Leo stood by, his face a mask of anxiety, ready to chock the wheels or fetch a tool at a moment's notice. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to haul on the ropes. The great wheel groaned in protest, resisting. For a terrifying moment, it seemed it wouldn't move. Then, with a shudder that ran through the frozen ground, it began to lift, inch by agonizing inch. It took them the entire day. Their muscles burned, their lungs ached, but they kept hauling, their movements synchronized, a small human machine working in perfect harmony. As the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow, the wheel finally cleared the ground and swung into position. With a final, coordinated effort, they lowered it onto the heavy, grease-slathered axle. It settled into place with a deep, satisfying thud. They stood back, exhausted, filthy and trembling with a mixture of fatigue and triumph. The wheel was in place. It stood like a monument against the winter sky, a symbol of their defiance, a testament to what a desperate family could achieve with nothing but their own 2 hands and a brilliant, stubborn mind. That night, For the first time in weeks, they allowed themselves a moment of rest. As Leo slept, exhausted in his room, Sarah found Isaac sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, his body racked by a deep, shuddering cough. The weeks of hard labor in the cold had taken a terrible toll on his fragile lungs. She came and stood behind him, her hands resting gently on his thin, shaking shoulders. "You need to rest, Isaac," she said softly. "This is killing you." He looked up at her, his dark eyes clouded with pain but burning with an undiminished fire. "The body is just a machine, Sarah," he rasped. "Sometimes it breaks down, but the work has to be finished." In that moment, looking down at this proud, brilliant, fragile man who was sacrificing his own health for her and her son, the last of Sarah's emotional defenses crumbled. The respect, the gratitude, the deep, quiet affection she had been feeling for him coalesced into a single powerful wave of love. It was a love born not of courtship and romance, but of shared struggle, of mutual salvation. He had saved her from despair, and she had saved him from death. Their marriage of convenience had, without either of them noticing, become a marriage of the truest and deepest kind. She leaned down and kissed the top of his head. "We'll finish it together," she whispered. The final 2 weeks were a blur of activity. They connected the wheel to the system of gears and the alternator. Isaac, with Leo's help, ran the heavy copper wires from the shed up to the house. The town of Harmony Creek, which had found their project a source of endless amusement, now watched with a sullen, baffled silence. The thing by the creek no longer looked like a joke. It looked like something real, something serious. They didn't understand what it was, but they could recognize the grim, relentless purpose with which the Washington family worked. On the final day before the foreclosure deadline, the work was done. The creek, partially dammed and channeled through their sluice, flowed with a powerful concentrated force. The wires were connected to a single bare light bulb that Isaac had hung from a rafter in the barn. The entire family stood in the cold, cavernous space of the barn, their breath misting in the air, their eyes fixed on the bulb. "Okay," Isaac said, his voice raspy but steady. "I'm going to open the gate. If the calculations are right." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He walked down to the creek, his steps slow and deliberate. Sarah held Leo's hand, her own hand so tight the boy winced. They watched as Isaac pulled on the heavy wooden lever that would open the sluice gate and release the water onto the wheel. They heard a distant rumble as the water began to flow. Then came a deep, groaning sound as the massive water wheel began to turn, slowly at first, then faster and faster, its great paddles scooping up the creek water and turning the axle. Inside the barn, they could hear the whirring of the gears, a rising mechanical hum that grew in pitch and volume. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The sound from the shed grew to a high-pitched whine. They all stared at the light bulb. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the filament in the bulb flickered, a tiny, hesitant orange spark. It flickered again, and then, with a sudden magical brilliance, it glowed. It blazed to life, a steady, pure white light that banished the shadows from the barn and illuminated their 3 stunned, hopeful faces. They had done it. Against all odds, against all logic, against the full weight of the town's scorn and the bank's power, they had made light in the darkness. The light from the bare bulb was more than just electricity. It was a beacon, a fierce and undeniable declaration of their victory over the darkness that had threatened to consume them. For a long moment, the 3 of them just stood there in the barn, bathed in its clean white glow, the steady hum of the generator, a triumphant symphony in the background. Leo let out a whoop of pure joy, breaking the spell, and Sarah finally let go of the breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 months. She laughed, a real unburdened laugh, and pulled Isaac into a hug, heedless of his racking cough. In the bright, steady light, they were not a widow, a sick soldier, and a small boy. They were a family, forged and tempered in the crucible of that long, cold winter. Their celebration, however, was short-lived. The light was a victory, but it was not money. The deadline was the next day. Mr. Abernathy would arrive, his face a mask of false sympathy, with the sheriff at his side to serve the eviction papers. Their miraculous machine, their monument to defiance, would become his property, along with the rest of the farm. That evening, as Sarah put Leo to bed, the boy's face was clouded with confusion. "We did it, Mama," he said, his voice small. "We made the light. Why do we still have to leave?" Sarah's heart ached. How could she explain the cruel, arbitrary power of money to a child who had just witnessed the pure, tangible magic of science and hard work? "The light is our victory, honey," she said, stroking his hair. "No matter what happens tomorrow, you remember that. We made light." But Isaac had not given up. While Sarah was lost in a bittersweet mixture of pride and dread, his mind was working, turning the problem over and over. He sat at the kitchen table, the foreclosure notice laid out before him, a single powered light bulb hanging from the ceiling above, casting a bright, clear light on the page. He was staring at the letter, but he was seeing something else. He was seeing a system, and he was looking for the flaw. The next morning, they awoke to a world transformed. A massive blizzard had swept in during the night, a storm of legendary proportions that had been churning its way across the Midwest. Harmony Creek was buried under 2 feet of thick, heavy snow, with drifts piling up even higher. The wind howled, a mournful, relentless shriek that rattled the old farmhouse. The world outside was a swirling vortex of white, and the power was out. The single, fragile line that fed the town from the county station had, as it always did in a major storm, snapped. Harmony Creek was plunged into a state of cold, isolated darkness. But inside the Washington farmhouse, the lights were on. The water wheel by the creek, impervious to the snow, turned relentlessly, and the generator hummed its steady, reassuring tune. Their small home was an island of light and warmth in a sea of darkness and cold. It was mid-morning when they heard the sound, a low, grinding roar that was barely audible over the howl of the wind. A snowplow, the big county machine, was battling its way down the road from town. Behind it, just as Sarah had predicted, was Mr. Abernathy's black Buick. The convoy came to a stop at the end of their lane. Abernathy and the town sheriff, a large, slow-moving man named Cooley, began the long, difficult trudge through the deep snow toward the house. Sarah's heart sank. Even a blizzard couldn't stop him. He was coming to claim his prize. She met them at the door, her face a pale, grim mask. Isaac stood just behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, a silent, supportive presence. "Sarah," Abernathy said, his voice oozing a false solicitousness as he stomped the snow from his boots. "Terrible storm. Sheriff Cooley and I were worried about you and the boy out here all alone. We thought we'd come and check on things." He peered past her into the brightly lit hallway. His eyes widened slightly in surprise, but he quickly masked it. "Glad to see you have your lamps lit." "It's not a lamp, Mr. Abernathy," Sarah said, her voice cold and clear. "It's a light bulb." Abernathy and Sheriff Cooley exchanged a look of confusion. "But the power's out all over the county," Cooley said, his brow furrowed. "Our power isn't," Isaac said, stepping forward. His voice was quiet, but it held a new, unshakable authority. "We generate our own." He led them through the house to the back window, which looked out over the creek. Through the swirling snow, the 2 men could see it, the massive, impossible wheel, turning steadily in the churning water, a machine that had no right to exist, powering this small island of civilization. Abernathy stared, his mouth slightly agape. The laughter he had heard in the general store, the jokes about the widow's folly, died in his throat. This was not the act of a madwoman. This was something else entirely. This was formidable. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty, of respect, entered his eyes. He quickly recovered his composure, his mind already calculating, reassessing. "A remarkable project," he said, his tone shifting from condescending to calculating. "Truly, but I'm afraid it doesn't change the business at hand. The deadline for the loan was today. I have the papers right here." He tapped his breast pocket. We know, Isaac said calmly, but we have a proposal for you. Din! What happened next was not something Sarah had expected. Isaac, her quiet, reserved husband, took charge. He was no longer the broken soldier, the charity case. He was an engineer, a strategist, and he was on his home turf. He laid out his plan on the kitchen table, his drawings and calculations spread out under the brilliant, steady light of their own making. This generator, he began, his voice steady despite his rasping cough, is a prototype. It currently produces about 10 kilowatts, enough for this house and then some. But the creek's potential is far greater. With a larger turbine and a second generator which I can build, this system could produce over 100 kilowatts of power. Abernathy and Cooley listened, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and fascination. "What's your point, Mr. Washington?" Abernathy asked, his voice laced with impatience. "My point," Isaac said, "is that Harmony Creek is in the dark, again, and it will be for days. My point is that your bank, Mr. Abernathy, is also in the dark. Your brand new adding machines are useless. Your records are inaccessible. The town's commerce has ground to a halt, all because of a single, unreliable power line." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I can get your bank's lights on," Isaac said, his eyes locking with Abernathy's. "I can run a line into town. I can power the general store, the doctor's office, the depot. I can save every side of beef in Doris May Pringle's freezer. I can keep this town from freezing to death. I am offering you a partnership. You finance the expansion of this project. In return, the newly formed Harmony Creek Power and Light Company will provide reliable, inexpensive electricity to this town, with the bank as our primary partner and investor." Abernathy stared at him, speechless. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the proposal was stunning. This man, this sick black soldier he had intended to crush and cast aside, was not begging for an extension. He was negotiating. He was offering a solution to a problem Abernathy hadn't even realized was his biggest vulnerability. "That's preposterous," Abernathy stammered, but his words lacked conviction. His mind, the mind of a banker, was already racing, calculating the potential profits, the political capital he would gain by bringing reliable power to the region. He looked around the warm, brightly lit kitchen, then thought of his own cold, dark bank, his own cold, dark home. If Sarah's stubborn courage in this moment has moved you, her refusal to be broken by a system designed to crush her, a super thanks is the most direct way to help us continue to honor souls as resilient as hers. Her fight was not just for her farm, but for a future she dared to invent. The $2,000 for the mortgage, Isaac continued, pressing his advantage, will be considered the bank's initial investment in the company. The deed to this land with its water rights will be our collateral, and my wife and I will be the majority shareholders. It was a masterful stroke. He was not asking for a loan. He was accepting an investment. He was transforming their debt into equity. He had taken Abernathy's weapon and reforged it into a tool of their own empowerment. Sheriff Cooley, a simple man who understood power, not in terms of money but in terms of practical reality, was the first to speak. "Can you really do it, son?" he asked, looking at Isaac with a newfound respect. "Can you really get the town's lights on?" "I can have a line run to the bank and the store by tomorrow evening," Isaac said, without a hint of doubt. Abernathy was silent for a long time, his shrewd eyes darting from Isaac's confident face to the humming wires, to the snow-swept darkness outside. He was a predator, but he was also a pragmatist. He recognized a paradigm shift when he saw one. He had come to the farmhouse to foreclose on a widow and a broken man. He was now being offered a chance to be a hero, the man who brought modernity to Harmony Creek, and to make a tidy profit in the process. His prejudice was a powerful force, but his greed was even stronger. "Draw up the papers," he said finally, his voice tight. "Have them on my desk when the roads are clear. We have a deal, Mr. Washington." He turned and left without another word, Sheriff Cooley following in his wake, his expression one of dazed admiration. Sarah stood by the window and watched them trudge back through the snow to the waiting Buick. two men who had arrived as conquerors and were leaving as business partners. She turned to Isaac, her eyes shining with tears. He was leaning against the table, a wave of exhaustion washing over him now that the confrontation was over. He had gambled everything on his own ingenuity, on Abernathy's greed, and on a blizzard, and he had won. Harmony Creek, power and light, she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. It has a nice ring to it. It does, he agreed, his own tired smile matching hers. He had not just saved their farm. He had offered a new future to the very town that had scorned him. The deal struck in the warm, bright kitchen of the farmhouse was a seismic event, shifting the foundations of power in Harmony Creek. For Mr. Abernathy, it was a purely transactional pivot. His plan to acquire Sarah's farm for pennies on the dollar had been thwarted by an unforeseen variable, Isaac's genius. But a new, far more lucrative opportunity had presented itself. To be the man who brought reliable electricity to the valley, to hold the reins of the town's newest and most vital utility, that was a form of power far greater than owning another 30 acres of land. His prejudice against Isaac remained, a hard kernel of resentment in his gut, but it was now secondary to his ambition. He would own the majority of the financing, and therefore, he believed, he would still own the man. For the rest of Harmony Creek, the transformation was a far more bewildering and humbling process. The day after the storm, just as he had promised, Isaac, with the help of Sarah, Leo, and two stunned but willing farmers from down the road whom Abernathy had conscripted, ran a heavy cable from their generator to the town square. It was a monumental back-breaking task, wading through waist-deep snow, stringing the wire from tree to tree. By nightfall, two buildings in the town were ablaze with light, the bank and the general store. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The rest of the town remained a dark, cold void, but the store became a beacon, a warm, bright sanctuary where people gathered not just for supplies, but for the simple human comfort of light. They huddled around the pot-bellied stove, their faces illuminated by the steady, unwavering glow of the electric bulbs overhead, and they spoke in hushed, awed tones. The power wasn't coming from some distant, faceless entity at the county seat. It was coming from the strange machine on the Washington farm. It was coming from the sick black soldier they had laughed at. The laughter died. It vanished completely, replaced by a grudging, baffled silence. The jokes about the widow's folly now seemed ignorant and mean-spirited. The men who had cackled at Isaac's uselessness now stood in his light, warming their hands, their faces etched with a new and unfamiliar respect. They didn't understand how he had done it. It was a kind of magic, a miracle born of gears and wire, but they could not deny the reality of it. He had delivered them from the darkness. Doris May Pringle underwent the most dramatic and reluctant transformation. Her freezers, filled with hundreds of dollars worth of meat, were saved from spoiling. Her store was the center of the universe, but this salvation had come at the hands of the two people she had most viciously scorned. When Sarah came into the store now, Doris May's sneer was gone, replaced by a stiff, awkward civility. "Can I help you, Sarah?" she would ask, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She could not bring herself to be kind, but she could no longer be cruel. The power dynamic had been irrevocably altered. Sarah was no longer the pitiful widow. She was the wife of the man who held the town's light switch. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The incorporation papers for the Harmony Creek Power and Light Company were drawn up, with Abernathy's lawyers ensuring the bank's interests were well protected. But Isaac, with a sharp, meticulous eye, reviewed every clause, making sure that his and Sarah's majority ownership and operational control were ironclad. He was no fool. He knew Abernathy was a partner of convenience, not of conscience. With the first infusion of the bank's capital, Isaac began the expansion. He didn't hire outside contractors. He hired the men of Harmony Creek. He put out a call for farmers who were idle during the winter months, offering fair wages for hard work. Men who had once laughed at him now lined up at his door, hats in hand, asking for a job. Isaac proved to be as brilliant a project manager as he was an engineer. He treated the men with a quiet, professional respect they had never expected. He didn't raise his voice or issue commands. He would unroll his blueprints on the hood of a truck and explain the task for the day, his voice calm and logical, making each man feel like a crucial part of a vital mission. He respected their skills, asking the blacksmith to forge custom brackets, consulting with the farmers about the best way to dig trenches in the frozen soil. He was their boss, but he was also their collaborator. He was a demanding leader, insisting on a level of precision and quality they had never encountered. A post that was a quarter of an inch out of plumb had to be redug. A wire that was not properly insulated had to be restrung. At first they grumbled, but they soon came to respect his relentless pursuit of excellence. They began to take pride in their work, in the straight, clean lines of the utility poles they were erecting, in the solid, humming power of the new, larger generator Isaac had designed and they had helped build. The town, which had once been united in its scorn for him, was now being rebuilt by him, both literally and figuratively. The men worked together, their shared labor breaking down the old walls of suspicion and prejudice. They saw Isaac not as a black man or a sick man, but as the chief, the quiet genius who could see things they couldn't, the man who was leading them into a new, brighter future. Sarah, meanwhile, found her own role transformed. She was the company's bookkeeper, the one who managed the payroll and the accounts. She would sit at her kitchen table, which had become the company headquarters, her pen scratching in the ledger, a task she found she had a surprising aptitude for. Abernathy had assumed she would be a silent partner, a figurehead. He was mistaken. Sarah had a will of iron and a memory like a steel trap. She questioned every expense, she negotiated with suppliers for better prices, and she made sure that every dollar of the bank's investment was accounted for. She and Isaac were a formidable team. He the visionary engineer, she the pragmatic, watchful guardian of their enterprise. Leo, too, found his place in this new world. He was the official mascot and apprentice of the Harmony Creek Power and Light Company. After school, he would help the work crews carrying water, coiling rope, and listening with rapt attention as Isaac explained the principles of electrical resistance or the mechanics of a transformer. The boys who had once bullied him now looked at him with a mixture of envy and awe. His father was the most important man in town, and Leo was his heir apparent. By the time the spring thaw arrived, Harmony Creek was a different place. A network of sturdy utility poles, built from local timber, now connected every house and farm in the valley to the humming powerhouse by the creek. On a designated evening in April, the whole town gathered in the square. Isaac, standing on a makeshift platform with Sarah and Leo at his side, gave a short, simple speech. "This wasn't my work," he said, his voice carrying over the silent, expectant crowd. "This was our work. We built this together." Then he gave a signal. All over the valley, in every farmhouse and home, people threw their main switches, and the town lit up. Porch lights bloomed in the twilight. Windows glowed with a warm golden light. A collective gasp. A sound of pure, unadulterated wonder went through the crowd, followed by a spontaneous, thunderous cheer. It was a cheer not just for the light, but for themselves, for what they had accomplished. They were no longer a town in the dark, but a community that had found its own power. In that moment, Isaac Washington was not a black man. Sarah Washington was not a foolish widow. They were the architects of a miracle, and the town they had saved was finally, gratefully, claiming them as their own. The laughter was a distant, shameful memory, drowned out by the roar of applause and the steady, powerful hum of the future they had built together. The successful electrification of Harmony Creek was a profound and lasting victory, but it did not solve all their problems. The company, though a technical marvel, was still a fledgling enterprise, walking a financial tightrope. Abernathy's initial investment had been entirely consumed by the construction, and now the monthly loan payments to his own bank began to fall due. A relentless rhythm of obligation. The revenue from the townspeople, most of whom were poor farmers themselves, trickled in slowly. They were cash poor, often paying their bills weeks or even months late. The Harmony Creek Power and Light Company was a pillar of the community, but it was a pillar built on shaky financial ground. Isaac, ever the pragmatist, understood this better than anyone. He knew that the single generator, while sufficient for the town's current needs, was their single point of failure. A major flood, a mechanical breakdown, or a simple lightning strike could plunge the town back into darkness and their company into bankruptcy. He began to design a second redundant system, a backup generator powered not by water, but by a diesel engine. It was a necessary precaution, but it required capital they simply did not have. Abernathy, who had been a surprisingly passive partner during the initial build-out, now began to assert his influence. He saw the company's financial fragility as an opportunity. He would not approve a second loan for the backup generator. Instead, he made a proposal at a formal board meeting held in the back room of his own bank. He proposed that the company issue new shares to raise the required capital. He, of course, would be the primary buyer of these new shares. Sarah saw the trap immediately. "He's trying to dilute our ownership," she told Isaac that night, her voice tight with anger. "If he buys up enough new shares, he'll control more than 50%. He'll have controlling interest. He'll be able to vote us out, take over everything we've built. He couldn't take the farm, so now he's trying to steal the company." Isaac nodded grimly. "It's a classic corporate raid," he said. "He's using our own success against us. The more valuable the company becomes, the more he wants to control it." They were caught in a vice. Without the backup generator, the company was vulnerable, but the only path to financing it seemed to lead directly into Abernathy's trap. For weeks, they were at an impasse. Isaac worked on the designs for the diesel generator in his spare time, a project that existed only on paper, while Sarah pored over the account books, trying to squeeze every last penny of profit from their meager revenues. The quiet joy of their initial victory had been replaced by a new, more sophisticated kind of anxiety. They had defeated the town's prejudice, but now they were fighting a war on a different battlefield, the cold, unforgiving world of finance. The solution, when it came, arrived not from a blueprint or a ledger, but from the sky. The spring of 1955 was a wet one, with relentless, week-long rains that turned the fields to mud and swelled the creek to a brown, churning torrent. The townspeople, secure in their new electric world, were grateful for Isaac's foresight. The water wheel, built with his customary precision, handled the increased flow with ease, the generator humming a steady, powerful tune. But the rains didn't stop. The creek rose higher and higher until it was threatening to breach its banks. Isaac, monitoring the water levels with a worried eye, knew that his generator was safe, but the town was not. The creek, which ran through the lowest part of the valley, was on the verge of a major flood, the kind that came once every 50 years. The old-timers in the town remembered the last one in 1905, which had washed away 3 houses and inundated the entire downtown area under 4 feet of water. Abernathy and the town council, such as it was, were paralyzed. They held a meeting in the general store, wringing their hands, looking at the rising water with a sense of fatalistic dread. There was nothing to be done, they concluded. They could only pray the rains would stop. Isaac, who'd been listening from the back of the room, stepped forward. "Prayer is good," he said, his voice cutting through the worried chatter. "But an earthworks dam is better." All eyes turned to him. "A dam?" the mayor scoffed. "Son, we don't have time to build a dam. The water will be in this store by morning." We don't need a permanent dam," Isaac explained, unrolling a piece of butcher paper he had brought with him. He quickly sketched a map of the valley with a piece of charcoal. "We need a temporary one. A levee, right here." He drew a thick line across a narrow point in the valley, a mile upstream from the town. "If we can build a 10-foot-high earth wall right there, we can divert the worst of the floodwaters into the old quarry. It will hold the water until the creek subsides." It was a bold, brilliant plan, an engineer's solution to a seemingly insurmountable problem. But the men in the room were farmers, not engineers. They looked at his drawing with skepticism. "An earth wall?" one of them said. "What are we supposed to build it with? Our bare hands? We'd need a bulldozer, a steam shovel." "No," Isaac said, his voice resonating with an authority they had all come to respect. "You have something better. You have tractors. 20 of them at least in this valley. And you have plows? We can move a lot of earth with 20 tractors. He turned and looked at the men, his gaze sweeping across their faces. But we have to start now. We have about 12 hours. What followed was the most remarkable night in the history of Harmony Creek. Spurred to action by Isaac's plan and his unwavering confidence, the town mobilized. It was no longer a collection of individuals, but a single unified army with Isaac as its general. He directed the operation with a calm, decisive leadership that was nothing short of astonishing. He dispatched teams of men in their tractors to the narrow point in the valley he had identified. He organized another team to start filling sandbags. The women, led by Sarah, set up a command post in the church basement, brewing endless pots of coffee and making sandwiches to fuel the workers. Isaac was everywhere at once. He stood in the pouring rain, his thin frame soaked, his uniform a muddy wreck, directing the tractor drivers with hand signals like a conductor leading an orchestra. He showed them how to plow in a specific pattern, turning the earth up and pushing it into a long, high mound. The roar of the tractor engines, the shouts of the men, the relentless drumming of the rain, it was a scene of organized, chaotic, beautiful human effort. Sarah watched him, her heart filled with a mixture of terror and awe. He was pushing his body far beyond its limits. His cough was a constant tearing sound, and his face was pale with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. He was fueled by a force more powerful than his own physical frailties, a sense of duty, a responsibility for the town that had once rejected him. As the night wore on, the creek continued to rise, a brown, menacing snake slithering ever closer to the town. The work at the makeshift dam became a frantic race against the water. The men, their faces grim with determination, worked without complaint, their earlier skepticism replaced by a fierce, desperate trust in Isaac's plan. Mr. Abernathy, to everyone's surprise, was there as well. Stripped of his suit coat, his hands soft and uncalloused, he worked alongside the other men, filling sandbags, his face a mask of grim determination. In the face of a common, overwhelming threat, the old hierarchies of the town had dissolved. He was no longer the bank president. He was just another man fighting to save his home, his business, his town. And he was following the orders of a sick black soldier. Just before dawn, as the first grey light began to creep over the horizon, the creek finally reached the base of their makeshift levee. A collective gasp went through the exhausted workers. For a moment, it seemed the water would simply push through the loosely packed earth. It seeped into the base of the wall, turning the mud dark, but the wall held. The tons of earth, packed down by the weight of the tractors, resisted the pressure. The water, finding its path blocked, began to back up and divert, just as Isaac had predicted, flowing down a secondary channel and into the vast, empty bowl of the old quarry. A ragged, exhausted cheer went up from the men. They had done it. They had held the line. The town was safe. Isaac stood watching the water divert, a small, satisfied smile on his face. Then, the strength that had held him upright for 24 hours finally gave out. His knees buckled and he collapsed into the mud, his body convulsing in a terrible, uncontrollable fit of coughing. The sight of Isaac collapsing sent a jolt of panic through the exhausted crew. The elation of their victory was instantly replaced by a stark, terrifying fear. The man who had been their rock, their brilliant, unshakable leader, was now a fragile, broken figure lying in the mud, his body racked by a cough so violent it seemed it would tear him apart. The men who had been following his every command just moments before now stood frozen, helpless, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They had watched him push himself relentlessly all night, had heard the escalating severity of his cough, but had been too caught up in the desperate fight to fully comprehend the toll it was taking. Sarah was the first to move. She ran to him, her feet sinking into the slick mud, and knelt at his side. She cradled his head in her lap, her hands stroking his sweat-soaked hair, murmuring his name over and over. His eyes were squeezed shut in pain, his face a ghastly shade of grey. Each cough was a tearing, rasping sound that seemed to pull up nothing but his own life force. "Get Dr. Miller!" she screamed, her voice raw with a terror she had not felt since the day her first husband had died. "Someone, get the doctor now!" Two of the younger farmers jolted into action, scrambled back to their tractors, and roared off toward town. The rest of the men gathered in a tight, silent circle around Sarah and Isaac, their faces grim, their earlier triumph completely forgotten. They looked down at the man who had just saved their homes, their land, their town, and were confronted with the terrible, undeniable truth of his fragility. They had seen his mind, his will, but had refused to see his sickness. Now they could see nothing else. Mr. Abernathy pushed his way through the circle. His face, usually a mask of shrewd calculation, was pale and drawn, his eyes wide with a genuine, unfeigned alarm. He knelt in the mud on the other side of Isaac, his fine trousers soaking up the grime. "Isaac, son, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice strained. The honorific son, so casually used by powerful white men to subordinate younger black men, sounded different now. It was stripped of its condescension, filled instead with a raw, paternal fear. Dr. Miller arrived 20 minutes later, his car skidding to a halt at the edge of the muddy field. He was flustered, his medical bag held aloft as he navigated the treacherous ground. He took one look at Isaac and his fussy, self-important demeanor vanished, replaced by the grim focus of a physician facing a true crisis. He listened to Isaac's chest with his stethoscope, his expression growing darker with every ragged, fluid-filled breath he heard. "It's pneumonia," he said, his voice low and grave. "A bad case. His lungs are filling up. We need to get him to the county hospital, now." The logistics of that were nearly impossible. The floodwaters had receded from the town, but the roads were a sea of mud and washouts. An ambulance could never make it through. It was Abernathy who took charge, his banker's mind immediately shifting to logistics. "We'll use my car," he said, his voice sharp with authority. "It's heavy. It'll handle the mud better than the doctors. 4 of you," he pointed to the strongest-looking farmers. "We'll carry him." What followed was a slow, agonizing procession back to town. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from 2 poles and a heavy canvas tarp, and the 4 farmers, their faces set with a grim determination, carefully lifted Isaac. They carried him across the muddy fields, their steps slow and deliberate, a funereal parade escorting their fallen commander from the field of battle. Sarah walked beside the stretcher, her hand never leaving Isaac's, her face a pale, tearless mask of grief. The entire town seemed to be waiting for them in the square. The news had spread with the speed of a brush fire. The hero who had saved them was dying. The men, women, and children of Harmony Creek stood in a silent, solemn crowd, their faces etched with a communal sense of guilt and shame. They had laughed at this man, they had scorned him, and he, in return, had sacrificed himself for them. The weight of their past cruelty was a palpable, suffocating presence in the rain-washed air. Doris May Pringle stood on the porch of her store, her hands clasped tightly, her perpetually sour face crumpled with an emotion that looked shockingly like grief. She watched as they loaded Isaac into the back of Abernathy's Buick, and as Sarah climbed in beside him, Doris May did something that stunned everyone who saw it. She ran inside the store and came back out with a thick, clean wool blanket, which she pushed through the car window into Sarah's hands. "For the trip," she mumbled, not meeting Sarah's eyes, and then she turned and hurried back inside, her shoulders shaking. It was an apology, the only one she knew how to give. The journey to the county hospital was a nightmare. Abernathy drove with a reckless, focused intensity, wrestling the heavy car through mud and washouts. Sarah sat in the back, cradling Isaac, who had lapsed into a semi-conscious state, his breathing growing ever more shallow, his body burning with fever. She prayed, not to a distant, benevolent God, but with a fierce, desperate intensity to the spirit of Isaac himself, willing him to fight, to hold on, to not leave her and Leo alone again. They arrived at the hospital, a stark, imposing brick building, and Isaac was rushed into the emergency ward. And there, Sarah collided with a wall more formidable than any flood, the casual, systemic racism of the world outside of Harmony Creek. A stern-faced nurse took one look at Isaac and then at Sarah. "The colored ward is in the basement," she said, her voice flat and dismissive. "He's a veteran," Sarah said, her voice shaking with a new kind of fury. "He has papers. He needs a doctor, not a basement." "All our doctors are busy, ma'am," the nurse said, already turning away. "He'll have to wait his turn." Before Sarah could respond, Abernathy stepped forward. He was no longer the mud-stained farmer from the levee. He was once again the bank president, radiating an aura of wealth and absolute authority. "My name is John Abernathy," he said, his voice low and cold as ice. "I am the president of the Harmony Creek First National Bank. This man is a decorated war hero and the chief engineer of the Harmony Creek Power and Light Company, of which I am the primary investor. He will be seen by your chief of staff in a private room within the next 5 minutes, or I will personally see to it that this hospital's funding is cut off at the county, state, and federal level. Do you understand me?" The nurse stared at him, her face paling. She had never been spoken to like that. She saw the steel in his eyes, the absolute certainty of his power, and she folded completely. "Yes, sir," she stammered. "Right away, sir." Isaac was moved to a clean, private room on the main floor. Doctors and nurses appeared as if from nowhere, and for the next 3 days, a strange and powerful vigil took place. Sarah never left his side, holding his hand, speaking to him, willing him to live. And every day, a carload of men from Harmony Creek, led by Abernathy himself, would make the difficult journey to the hospital. They would stand awkwardly in the hallway, their hats in their hands, waiting for news. They were a silent, solemn honor guard, paying tribute to their fallen leader. Abernathy, in a move that shocked Sarah to her core, took care of everything. He paid for the private room with cash from his own pocket. He used his influence to ensure Isaac was receiving the best care, the newest medicines, the full attention of the hospital's best physician. He was fighting for Isaac's life with the same relentless, pragmatic intensity with which he ran his bank. On the 3rd day, the doctor emerged from Isaac's room with a tired but hopeful smile. "The fever has broken," he told Sarah and the assembled men from Harmony Creek. "The antibiotics are working. He's a fighter. He's going to make it." A collective sigh of relief went through the hallway, a release of a tension that had held the entire town in its grip. Abernathy closed his eyes for a moment, his shoulders slumping. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time she saw not a banker, not a predator, but simply a man, relieved and profoundly weary. "Why?" she asked him later when they were alone for a moment. "Why did you do all this?" Abernathy was silent for a long time, looking out the hospital window. "That night," he said finally, his voice rough with an uncharacteristic emotion, "out on that levee, I watched him. He wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about the color of his skin or mine. He was just solving the problem. He was saving us, all of us. It occurred to me that I've spent my entire life looking at people and seeing only numbers on a ledger, black or white. He looked at us and saw neighbors. He's a better man than I am, Sarah, a much better man." It was a confession, a stunning admission of a transformed heart. The flood had washed away more than just the threat to the town. It had washed away the foundations of an old, cruel world, and in its place, something new, something better, had begun to grow. Isaac had saved the town, and in doing so, he had, impossibly, saved the soul of its most powerful man. Isaac's recovery was slow and arduous. He had won the battle against the pneumonia, but the war had left his lungs scarred and his body profoundly weakened. He spent 2 weeks in the county hospital, and when he was finally discharged, he was a shadow of his former self, thinner than ever, his breath still catching with the slightest exertion, but he was alive. And when he returned to Harmony Creek, he did not return as an outsider. He returned as a hero. The homecoming was a quiet, deeply emotional affair. There was no parade, no formal celebration. Instead, as Abernathy's car drove slowly down the main street, the people of the town simply came out of their homes and stores and stood in silent tribute. They lined the street, men, women, and children, their faces filled with a mixture of gratitude, relief, and a profound communal shame for their past behavior. They didn't cheer or wave, they just stood, their presence a solemn, powerful apology. As the car passed, the men removed their hats, a gesture of ultimate respect. Isaac, sitting pale and exhausted in the back seat with Sarah's arm around him, looked out at the same faces that had once stared at him with suspicion and scorn, and he nodded, a small, weary acknowledgement of their silent amends. The world to which he returned was fundamentally different. The power dynamic, which had begun to shift with the creation of the Light Company, had now been completely upended. Isaac was no longer just the town's engineer. He was its savior, its reluctant patriarch. His word, once dismissed, now carried the weight of law. The men who had been his employees now treated him with a reverent deference, calling him Mr. Washington, a title they had never used before. They would come to the farm not just for work orders, but for advice on everything from crop rotation to a sick cow to a dispute with a neighbor. They had seen the power of his mind, the clarity of his judgment under pressure, and they trusted it implicitly. Abernathy, true to his transformation, became Isaac's staunchest ally. The attempted corporate raid was never spoken of again. Instead, the bank president threw his full financial and political weight behind the Harmony Creek Power and Light Company. He secured a new, low-interest loan for the diesel backup generator, calling it a vital piece of community infrastructure. He used his connections at the state capitol to get the company certified as a rural cooperative, a move that gave them tax breaks and access to federal grants. He had recognized that Isaac's genius was the town's greatest asset, and he was now determined to protect and nurture it, not for altruistic reasons alone, but because he understood that the town's prosperity was inextricably linked to Isaac's. A rising tide, he now realized, lifted all boats, including his own. Sarah watched these changes with a sense of quiet, profound wonder. The laughter that had haunted her was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding respect. She was no longer the poor widow or that foolish woman. She was Mrs. Washington, the wife of the town's most important citizen, a formidable businesswoman in her own right. She and Isaac were a true partnership in their home and in their company. Their marriage, born of convenience and necessity, had been forged in the crucible of shared struggle and had become a bond of deep, unshakable love. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch, watching the lights of the town they had built twinkle in the valley below, a testament to their improbable journey. But the most significant change was in Isaac himself. The physical toll of his illness was undeniable. He moved slower, his cough was a constant companion, and he would never again be able to perform hard physical labor. But the illness and the flood had done something else to him. It had broken down the final walls of his reserve. Before, he had been a quiet, contained man, holding the world at a distance, his dignity a form of self-preservation against the constant slights and aggressions he faced. But in saving the town, he had been forced to engage with it, to lead it, to care for it. And in return, the town had finally, unequivocally claimed him. He had found something he never expected to find in this small, forgotten corner of Ohio, a home. He was no longer a stranger, an outsider. He was a part of a community, bound to it by the shared trauma and triumph of the flood. He poured his energy, what little he had, into his work. The Harmony Creek Power and Light Company became his legacy. With Abernathy's backing, he began to innovate. He designed and built a small, refrigerated locker plant in the center of town, powered by their own electricity, which allowed the local farmers to store their meat and produce safely, revolutionizing the local agricultural economy. He ran a power line to the one-room schoolhouse, bringing bright, steady light to the children for the first time. He even designed a small, electrically powered irrigation pump for one of the farms, dramatically increasing its crop yield. Each project was a quiet, methodical step forward, lifting the entire community. He was not just providing power, he was providing opportunity. He was giving the people of Harmony Creek the tools to build a better future for themselves. 2 years after the flood, the town faced a new kind of threat. A large, predatory power company from the state capital, Consolidated Power and Light, began buying up the smaller rural cooperatives in the region. Their method was simple and ruthless. They would offer a low introductory rate to undercut the local company, drive it into bankruptcy, and then, once they had a monopoly, they would raise the rates to exorbitant levels. Their next target was Harmony Creek. They sent a slick, fast-talking executive named Peterson to a town meeting. Peterson presented a glossy proposal promising lower rates, professional service, and a connection to the statewide power grid. He patronizingly referred to the Harmony Creek Power and Light Company as a charming, rustic enterprise, but one that was ultimately unreliable and outdated. "It's time for Harmony Creek to join the 20th century, he concluded with a smug smile. The townspeople listened, and a murmur of uncertainty went through the room. Lower rates were a powerful temptation for a community where every penny counted. They looked from Peterson's expensive suit to Isaac, who sat quietly at the back of the room, looking thinner and more tired than ever. Abernathy, in his role as bank president, spoke first. He laid out the financial risks of the buyout, the danger of losing local control. But his arguments were complex, full of numbers and financial jargon. Peterson easily rebutted them with slick charts and confident promises. It seemed the town was wavering. Then one of the oldest farmers in the valley, a man named Jedediah Smith, who had been one of the tractor drivers on the night of the flood, stood up. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, his face a roadmap of his 80 years. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "that's a real nice suit you got there, and them are some real fancy promises, but I got a question for you." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his neighbors. 2 years ago, when the creek was rising and the water was about to wash away my farm, my home, everything my family has built for 100 years, where was Consolidated Power and Light? Where were your fancy charts and your professional servicemen then?" He turned and pointed a trembling finger at Isaac. "I'll tell you where we were. We were standing in the mud and the rain, in the middle of the night, fighting for our lives. And that man there, that man was leading us. He didn't have no fancy suit. He had an idea, and he had the courage to see it through, even when it nearly killed him. This company," Jedediah's voice rose with a powerful, righteous anger, "ain't just a company, it's a monument. It's a monument to the night we stood together and saved ourselves, and we ain't selling it, not for a penny less than it's worth, and it's worth more than you could ever afford." A profound silence filled the room, and then it was broken. A single person began to clap, then another and another, until the entire room erupted in a thunderous, sustained ovation. It was not just applause for Jedediah's words. It was a defiant roar of solidarity, a community declaring its independence. They were choosing loyalty over price, community over corporation. They were choosing the man who had stood with them in the mud. Peterson, the slick executive, stood frozen, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. He had come prepared to fight a financial battle, but he had walked into a moral one. He had no weapons for this kind of fight. He gathered his glossy brochures, his face red with humiliation, and left the meeting without another word. Isaac sat at the back of the room, his head bowed as the applause washed over him. Sarah, sitting beside him, squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with tears of pride. He had not said a word. He had not needed to. The town he had saved had, in its own time, in its own way, returned the favor. They had saved him. They had saved their company. They had saved themselves. The quiet, sick soldier had given them the power to light their homes, and in doing so, had taught them where their true power lay. Not in the lines that came from outside, but in the bonds that held them together. Your generous support through Super Thanks ensures that the fire of these powerful memories will never be extinguished. Thank you.